The modern world does not run on alliances alone. It runs on pipelines, shipping routes, and financial systems that stretch across continents. And hidden inside that network is a quiet geopolitical reality. If Iran were to suffer a decisive strategic defeat in a regional war, Russia would lose far more than a partner. It would lose a critical piece of the alternative economic architecture it has been trying to build since Western sanctions began isolating its economy. The question then is not simply whether Iran can win or lose a conflict. The deeper question is why Russia cannot afford for Iran to lose. To understand that, we need to look beyond the battlefield and into the global systems that connect energy markets, trade corridors, and geopolitical power. Because the relationship between Moscow and Tehran has never been just about ideology. It is about survival inside an increasingly fragmented global order. The shift began long before the current wave of geopolitical tensions. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, the United States and the European Union imposed the first major round of coordinated sanctions against the Russian economy. Banks faced restrictions. Energy companies lost access to Western financing and technology. Investment flows slowed, but the pressure intensified dramatically after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Russian banks were removed from key parts of the global financial system. Energy exports faced price caps and new trade barriers. Western companies exited the Russian market at unprecedented speed. Almost overnight, Russia faced the challenge of reorienting its entire economic system away from Europe, and that required new partners. China quickly became Russia's largest trading partner. But China alone could not provide every solution. Russia also needed alternative transport corridors, alternative financial mechanisms, and alternative energy partnerships. This is where Iran became strategically important. For decades, Iran had lived under heavy international sanctions. Its economy had adapted to limited access to Western banks, restrictions on oil exports, and barriers to international trade. Iran had developed methods for operating inside a constrained financial environment. For Russia, suddenly facing similar pressures, that experience mattered. The two countries began strengthening cooperation across several sectors. Energy coordination expanded, military cooperation increased, and perhaps most importantly, infrastructure projects linking their economies began accelerating. One of the most significant of these projects is the International North-South Transport Corridor. At first glance, it sounds like a technical logistics initiative. In reality, it represents a major geopolitical shift. The corridor connects Russia to the Indian Ocean through Iran using railways, ports, and shipping routes. Goods can travel from Russian cities to the Caspian Sea, move across Iranian territory, and reach ports on the Persian Gulf. From there, cargo can be shipped to India and other Asian markets. Compared to traditional routes through Europe or the Suez Canal, this corridor can shorten shipping distances between Russia and South Asia. But the real importance lies in something else: control. Trade routes shape geopolitical independence. For centuries, empires competed not just for territory, but for control over the paths through which goods moved. Today, those paths include sea lanes, rail networks, pipelines, and digital financial infrastructure. The North-South Corridor allows Russia to reduce reliance on routes influenced by Western allies, and Iran sits at the center of that system. If Iran were destabilized by war or internal collapse, that corridor could become unreliable. Railways could stop operating. Ports could become unsafe. Insurance markets might refuse to cover shipments moving through the region. The entire logistical chain would weaken. For Russia, that would mean losing one of the most promising trade routes connecting its economy to the global south. Energy markets create another layer of strategic alignment. Russia and Iran both hold some of the largest oil and natural gas reserves in the world. Under normal circumstances, they might compete for market share. But sanctions have changed the equation. Both countries face restrictions on selling energy to Western markets. As a result, they increasingly redirect exports toward Asia. India and China have become major buyers of discounted Russian oil. Iran has also relied heavily on Asian markets to sell its crude despite sanctions. Because both countries operate under similar constraints, their interests often overlap. They both benefit when global oil prices remain relatively strong. Higher prices help offset the discounts they must offer to attract buyers willing to navigate sanctions risks. But energy markets are extremely sensitive to geopolitical stability. If Iran were severely weakened by conflict, production disruptions could ripple through the Persian Gulf. And the Persian Gulf remains one of the most important energy corridors on the planet. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Any prolonged disruption there would immediately affect global markets. At first glance, higher oil prices might appear beneficial for Russia, but the situation is more complicated. Extreme volatility can reduce demand, destabilize financial markets, and push governments to accelerate energy transitions away from fossil fuels. In other words, chaos in the energy system can create unpredictable outcomes that harm even major exporters. Russia therefore has a strong interest in preventing a collapse of regional energy stability, and Iran plays a central role in that stability. If you're interested in how power, oil, and money shape the world behind the headlines, consider subscribing to Rise and Ruin, Power of Wealth. Beyond energy and trade routes, financial systems form another critical layer of the Russia-Iran relationship. Modern sanctions rely heavily on control of global financial infrastructure. The dollar-based payment system, international banking networks, insurance markets that enable global shipping. When countries are cut off from these systems, their ability to trade internationally becomes far more difficult. Both Russia and Iran have been experimenting with ways to reduce dependence on Western financial channels. They have increased the use of national currencies in bilateral trade. They have explored linking their domestic financial messaging systems as alternatives to the SWIFT network. They have discussed expanding cooperation with other countries seeking greater financial autonomy from Western institutions. These efforts are still limited in scale. The global financial system remains overwhelmingly centered on the dollar and Western banking institutions. But for sanctioned economies, even partial alternatives can provide valuable flexibility. Iran is one of the few countries with decades of experience operating under such conditions. For Russia, losing that partner would mean losing a laboratory for sanctions adaptation. Military considerations also shape the relationship. Iran has provided Russia with drones used extensively in the conflict in Ukraine. These systems have played a role in Russia's strategy of targeting Ukrainian infrastructure and defense positions. The cooperation has expanded beyond simple procurement. Reports indicate that Russia has begun producing variants of Iranian-designed drones domestically, but the strategic significance extends further. Iran's regional influence complicates the strategic calculations of several Western-aligned states in the Middle East. For Russia, that influence indirectly disperses geopolitical pressure. If Iran's regional power diminished significantly, the balance of power in the Middle East could shift toward alliances more closely aligned with the United States and its partners. Such a shift would narrow Russia's diplomatic leverage in the region. Yet the most important factor may be structural rather than tactical. Russia is increasingly pursuing a vision of a multipolar world economy. In that vision, global trade and finance are not dominated by a single system centered on Western institutions. Instead, multiple regional networks coexist. Energy flows diversify. Trade corridors multiply. Financial systems become more fragmented. Iran fits into that vision as a crucial node connecting Eurasia, the Middle East, and South Asia. It provides geographic access to warm water ports. It anchors alternative transport corridors. And it represents a state willing to operate outside Western geopolitical frameworks. Remove that node, and the emerging network becomes weaker. For Russia, this is not just about preserving an ally. It is about preserving options. The global economic order is undergoing gradual but significant change. Energy markets are shifting. Supply chains are being reorganized. Sanctions are becoming more common tools of international policy. In such an environment, countries seek redundancy, alternative routes, alternative currencies, alternative partners. Iran provides several of those alternatives for Russia. If this helped you see the bigger picture, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Rise and Ruin, Power of Wealth for more documentaries on oil, power, and the forces shaping global finance. Because in the modern geopolitical landscape, wars rarely reshape the world through battlefield victories alone. They reshape the invisible systems that move energy, capital, and goods. And when those systems change, the balance of global power changes with them. For Russia, Iran is not just another country in the Middle East. It is a strategic junction in the emerging map of global trade and energy, which means the outcome of conflicts involving Iran will be felt far beyond the region itself, not only in military alliances, but in oil prices, shipping routes, financial networks, and the evolving architecture of the global economy. And that is why, in the quiet calculations of geopolitics, Russia cannot easily afford for Iran to lose.